A one-eyed giant, a witch who turns men into pigs, creatures whose song lures sailors to their deaths. The Odyssey sounds like pure invention. Except that over the last century, scholars have quietly matched most of those locations to real places on a real map. A strait that still generates whirlpools today, a volcano that has not gone fully dormant in centuries, a swamp that really did drive people to hallucinate, and fossil skulls with a single hole in the middle of the face, found on the exact island where the Cyclops was said to live. The monsters were real, they just weren't monsters. And here's the strangest part: after 10 years of tracking down giants and witches on a map, the one location nobody can agree on is the one Odysseus spent the entire story trying to reach: home. Start with the one almost everyone agrees on: Scylla, a six-headed monster on one cliff. Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallows entire ships on the other. Odysseus has to thread the gap between them. Ancient geographers, Polybius, Strabo, Pliny the Elder, all independently pointed at the same place: the Strait of Messina, the narrow channel between Sicily and mainland Italy. And that strait genuinely does produce whirlpools, where opposing tidal currents collide in a gap barely 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest. It still does today. In the 20th century, a French linguist named Victor Berard spent years cross-referencing ancient Phoenician sailing records against Mediterranean current data, trying to reconstruct the entire route. Another explorer, Tim Severin, went further. He built a ship using ancient methods and sailed the proposed course himself. In the story, Odysseus steers away from the whirlpool, hugs the other cliff, and loses 6 men to Scylla in a single pass. Read it as a monster story and it's horror. Read it as a sailing instruction and it's something else entirely. When both options are dangerous, take the one that costs you less. That's not mythology. That's a rule you'd pass down to anyone who had to sail that channel and come back alive. And it survives in English to this day, in the phrase between Scylla and Charybdis. The land of the Cyclops has been placed in Sicily since antiquity, near Mount Etna. But in the early 20th century, a paleontologist proposed something stranger. Caves in Sicily contain fossils of dwarf elephants, ice age animals that lived on the island. And an elephant skull has a large opening in the center of the face where the trunk attaches. To someone who had never seen an elephant, that skull looks like the head of a giant with one enormous eye socket in the middle of its forehead. These animals were real. Dwarf elephants shrank to a fraction of mainland size over generations of island isolation, and their remains are still turning up in Sicilian caves today. It's an elegant theory, and it comes with its own reversal. To support it, that scholar cited an ancient philosopher who had supposedly seen these fossils and concluded they were giants. Later researchers went looking for that citation. It doesn't exist. The theory explaining where a myth came from had a myth of its own baked into it, and yet the core idea is still taken seriously. Because notice what actually happens in the story. The sailors blind the giant with a heated stake and escape while it gropes around unable to see, a massive creature that cannot see properly. That is, oddly, exactly the impression a skull with one hollow socket would leave. The floating island ruled by Aeolus, keeper of the winds, is generally identified as the Aeolian Islands north of Sicily, and those islands are volcanic. Stromboli, one of them, is still erupting. It has not gone completely quiet in centuries, which is why sailors have called it the lighthouse of the Mediterranean for generations. Picture an ancient crew watching an island spit fire into the sky every night on a sea they barely understood. Concluding that a god who controls the wind lives there isn't superstition, it's a reasonable inference from the available evidence. In the story, Aeolus gives Odysseus every wind sealed in a leather bag, keeping out only the one that will carry him home. His crew, convinced their captain is hiding treasure from them, waits until he falls asleep and opens it, and the released winds blow them all the way back out to sea, with Ithaca already visible on the horizon. Circe's island, where men are turned into animals, has long been linked to Monte Circeo on the Italian coast. And here's the detail that matters. It used to be an island. It's connected to the mainland now, but in antiquity it was surrounded by marshland, malarial marshland. Sailors passing through swamps like that genuinely did experience fever and hallucinations. A story about a witch who scrambles men's minds is not a bad description of what malaria does to a crew. The sirens, whose singing lures sailors to their deaths, are usually placed at Lee Galley, a cluster of small islands off the Amalfi coast, a stretch of water with a long history of wrecks, and Odysseus does something unusual there. He doesn't avoid them, he plugs his crew's ears with wax, has himself tied to the mast and orders them not to release him no matter what he says. Then he listens to the whole thing. He wanted to know what it sounded like, he just made sure in advance that he couldn't act on it, which is more or less what we're doing right now, taking the myth seriously enough to check it, without believing it outright. Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso held Odysseus for 7 years, was placed by Hellenistic scholars at Gozo in modern Malta. though that identification has always been shakier than the others. 7 years is the longest single stop in the entire journey, and it's anchored to the vaguest location in it. Oddly, the next stop is far less disputed. After leaving Ogygia, a storm drives Odysseus to Syria, land of the Phaeacians, and both ancient and modern scholars largely agree that's Corfu. The Phaeacians are described as extraordinary sailors, and Corfu sits directly on the historical shipping route linking mainland Greece to Italy. The myth put its master mariners on the island where the actual master mariners live. It's the Phaeacians who finally give Odysseus a ship home. Which brings us to the real problem, Ithaca. There is an island in Greece called Ithaki today. Archaeologists have even recovered ancient bronze coins there stamped with Odysseus's face. Case closed, except in 2005, a researcher argued the opposite. The terrain Homer describes doesn't match Ithaki. Homer's Ithaca is described as low-lying and westernmost among its neighbors. Ithaki is neither. Too many details are simply wrong. His argument, built on geological evidence, was that the real Ithaca is the Peliki Peninsula on the western edge of the neighboring island, Kephallonia. It's joined to the main island now by a narrow isthmus, but he proposed that thousands of years of landslides and tectonic shift gradually filled in a channel that once separated them. It's a region that sits on one of the most seismically active fault zones in Europe, so the mechanism isn't far-fetched. If he's right, then the island Odysseus spent 10 years trying to reach isn't just misidentified, it stopped being an island at all sometime in the intervening 3,000 years. We can locate the monsters, we still can't locate home. The whirlpools of Messina, the living volcano, the malarial marsh, the shipping lane island, these matches are genuinely striking. But the classicist Peter Jones raises the obvious objection. This story was passed orally for centuries, reshaped every time it was retold, which makes it effectively impossible to confirm whether it reflects real geography at all. And there's a bigger problem, one that's easy to miss. The fastest route from Troy back to Greece is straight across the Aegean, a few weeks of sailing at most. Almost every proposed location on Odysseus's route is in the opposite direction, clustered hundreds of kilometers west, around Italy and Sicily. If this were a voyage log, it would be a log of a man sailing the wrong way for a decade. It looks less like a record of one journey and more like every frightening rumor sailors told each other about the Western Mediterranean, collected and threaded onto a single man's name, which raises an uncomfortable possibility that we're trying to map a story that was never built to be mapped, and that the reason the pieces fit so well is that they were assembled from real places to begin with, just never in that order. 3,000 years ago, some sailor met a whirlpool in a strait he didn't have a name for, and lost men to it. Another watched an island throw fire into the night sky and had no framework for what he was seeing. Neither of them expected anyone to call those things gods or monsters. They just wanted to come home and tell someone what they'd survived. They certainly didn't expect that 3,000 years later we'd still be sitting with a map open trying to work out exactly where they'd been. History doesn't disappear, we just haven't finished listening yet. If you want to keep digging into the stories history left buried, subscribe to Witness to Time.